So everyone, thank you very much for attending the fourth webinar here in our series. We'll go for about an hour or so today. I just wanted to remind you, if you'd like to view any of our materials from last year, you can get them on our website, gardner.law. And these slides will be also sent out to you. So there's a link here in the bottom right that you can easily access. And then also for this year's materials, you can also get those on our website. We had these 3 webinars previously, so this is our 4th and final for our fall update here. Other topics before were around privacy, other regulatory updates, for example, the EUA, which is a very hot topic right now, obviously with the vaccines getting reviewed currently at the FDA. And then we also discussed the OIG special fraud alert on speaker programs just a few weeks ago. We also talked about some recent fraud and abuse cases, among other topics. So I'll introduce myself briefly, and then Andreas will do the same. My name is Mark Gardner. I'm a managing attorney at Gardner Law. We specialize in FDA law, also fraud and abuse, privacy, transparency. My background before founding the firm, I worked in the device industry and also diagnostic sector. I have an MBA and I teach drug and device law at a local law school in Minnesota. Andreas, would you like to give a little background on yourself?
Yes, thank you, Mark. First, good morning and good evening, wherever you are at the moment. Yeah, I'm Andreas Driver. I'm a partner with Field Fisher in the Munich office. I'm admitted in Germany and also in New York, even though I don't practice US law anymore. Went to Georgetown for my master's. And so I do a lot of M&A work over the pond and more medtech and pharma. Yes, since we have a vibrant life science practice in Munich with Kurt Wildhoft, I'm very happy that we can work here more and more on these type of transactions. Just recently on a very interesting transaction we're going to discuss later on a little bit as well. And yes, look forward. Thank you, Mark.
Absolutely. So yeah, so I will bring the regulatory compliance perspective, and Andreas will bring that deal perspective, but Andreas has a lot of experience on the compliance side of things as well when it comes to deal making. So this is our agenda for today. First, we'll talk about performing and preparing for healthcare compliance diligence. We're really going to focus on the US, but keep in mind that there are corollaries throughout Europe, including Germany, obviously. So where think concepts like privacy and anti-bribery and being truthful and non-misleading communications are universal. We'll also talk about how to design and implement an effective healthcare compliance program. Again, we'll be focusing on how we've done that for clients, but Andreas will be offering his views as well. We'll get into typical due diligence questions and topics, really focusing on compliance, although Andreas will talk a little bit more about some other topics such as IP briefly that you'll be asked about that if you're looking to do a transaction. But yeah, we'll actually go through the questions that strategics ask, so you'll be kind of shown the teacher's manual, if you will, today. Andreas will talk briefly about deal structures, and then we'll talk about do's and don'ts while transaction is pending, and also a few case studies. All right, so the first topic is performing and preparing for healthcare compliance due diligence. So just to kind of start off, what is healthcare compliance, and what is really the universe of concepts that we're going to be talking about today? So just to drill down in that, because compliance could mean a lot of different things. We're really talking today about compliance with privacy laws, with anti-kickback type laws, fraud and abuse laws, False Claims Act. I have a list here of US laws, but suffice it to say there are corollaries again in Germany and elsewhere in Europe and throughout the world for that matter. But this list here that you see is not exhaustive. You can also think about the AdvaMed code or the Pharma code if you're a drug company. healthcare compliance is following industry best practices and also the laws. The best practices are really an embodiment of the law for the most part, and what the government expects industry to do. Although, as you saw in our last webinar, there's a bit of disruption right now with speaker programs, for example, because the government does not seem to favor them, and they are widespread in industry and both accepted by the AdvaMed and Pharma Code. So if you'd like more information on that, you can check out our last webinar. The second bullet here, I have most pharmaceutical and biotech. I'll just call them drug companies from now on. It's just fewer syllables for us to pronounce. And I'll refer to medical technology as device. So most drug and device companies now have a compliance function that's led by a compliance officer. Oftentimes that'll be like a general counsel within a company, but it could be a CFO. It's usually not a commercial role. When the government doesn't like a commercial person to be in charge of compliance. They do that as the fox guarding the hen house, if you will. But take a look at these laws, and just out of the interest of time, Andreas will not be running through each law that is the equivalent in Germany or in Europe for that matter. But this is what healthcare compliance is. It's really following these things that we've outlined here. Andreas, do you want to talk a little bit about why due diligence around healthcare compliance is important?
Yes, of course. First, you have the two sides. For the buyer, it's of course of interest. He's doing the due diligence and he wants to understand what he's purchasing here and what kind of problems he might inherit. Obviously, if you have a good up and running compliance system, then the buyer has a good possibility to gather what kind of risks he can see here, and he can know that actually risk can be identified in an appropriate time frame. If he would find out that the compliance system is not as elaborate as you would wish, then for him that doesn't necessarily mean obviously that there is something, there is a problem. But the problem he has is he doesn't know, and therefore he has to adjust, for example, the price. He has to do a more thorough due diligence on other parts. He has then asked for more reps and warranties. And for him also, it's going to be more complicated to integrate the company because he simply doesn't know whether the processes that he's seeing are really being complied with. For the seller, it's first, as you say, sell your company faster. That's a very important point, obviously, in this environment. You have more and more private equity companies coming into this field of practice. In Germany at least, they move away from automotive for obvious reasons. And they are really closing fast when they can, and that means the whole transactions are going to get more and more quicker, and therefore you have to have a process that is quick. So if you know what you're going to sell, then obviously you can avoid that the buyer is going to negotiate with you on possible but unknown problems. And obviously you do it in your own interest because you don't want to be criminal liable or actually become liable vis-a-vis the buyer due to a breach of reps and warranties later on.
Yeah, that makes sense. These are some fundamental, and by the way, if anybody has questions as we go, feel free to enter those into the chat function, and then Freya will bring them up to us. So don't feel bad if you'd like to interrupt us, it's no problem. We welcome your questions. These are the 7 fundamental compliance program elements. I guess I'll just finish the statement here that are commonly audited against. Again, somewhat universal here if you're looking internationally. Let's say you're a US company looking to buy a German company, it would be a good idea to ask them or apply these elements to that company. Looking at whether there's policies and procedures, if they have a compliance officer and a compliance committee. If you ask them, who is your compliance officer, and they say we don't have one, that's a red flag. Conducting effective training, education, lines of communication, keeping those open, conducting auditing, monitoring, having your rules publicized, and then responding to issues as they come up. These are really the core elements of compliance practice, if you will, healthcare compliance practice. Again, I would argue these are internationally recognized. What's interesting about compliance, it's healthcare compliance has been an evolving profession and discipline over the past couple of decades. There's no regulation, so to speak, where the government or law says you have to follow these requirements. But when the OIG comes out and says, this is the here's our compliance program guidance for pharmaceutical manufacturers, which by the way applies to medical technology, i.e. device manufacturers. When they come out and say, we want you to do these things, you better do them. That's the expectation. You could argue that you don't have to, but you know what the government wants, so you should follow their rules. What else is typically audited? Again, just flipping back to this slide, other than these 7 elements. And I want to we have a lot of slides here today, and we don't mean to overwhelm y'all, but I do want to spend a little time on this slide. Some of the others I may go through a bit quicker, but if you get nothing else out of this presentation, you're about to go into diligence, maybe it's next year you're planning to start to shop your company around, or you're looking to, it's time to for a transaction, maybe you're going public, whatever it may be, or you're going to take on some investment from strategics. These are the things that they're going to audit. And later on in the presentation, we actually list the questions that we expect them to ask you. Likewise, if you're a growing company and you're now looking to buy companies, you should be asking these things. These are the things you should look at. So all of the consulting arrangements, whether the consultant is a speaker or on your medical advisory board or they're a researcher or whatever it may be, the auditing party, again, whether that if you're going public, that's going to be likely a law firm that's going to come in and audit your compliance for the underwriter. They're going to ask you, put all your consulting agreements in the data room. We want to see all of them. So if you put them in there and half of them are expired or they all look different, or your payment rates are way out of whack, they're 3 times what fair market value is, those are issues that could stop your company from being bought, where the strategic just says, I'm not interested. You don't have your act together. I don't have time to go through every one of these, but I'll just kind of go through them quickly. If you have a speaker bureau function where you pay speakers to go and talk about your products, that's a hot topic right now. You can bet that the strategics are going to go into detail on that. How you're providing meals seems like a topic where some may say, gee, that doesn't seem really important. Well, it's really important to the government right now, how companies provide meals. I remember I had a client years ago, the CEO just said, we're not providing meals to anyone. He just was sick of the noise around meal provision and whatnot. I'm not saying you need to do that, but think about how you provide meals, what sort of referral arrangements you're trying to establish between a customer and a market. That can create anti-kickback concerns. You want to be careful with that. The types of materials that you're creating, how they're reviewed. It's interesting, we see less diligence in that area, but it does come up, especially with larger, more sophisticated players. But a lot of strategics or even underwriters and whatnot do not focus as much on the messaging. In fact, I think they probably should focus more on that because that's an area of high risk. Whether you're reporting the way you should be to authorities, and now the transparency requirements have exploded and they're all over the world. We have a list of those from a previous webinar and on our website that you could take a look at those if you wanted to, but that's an area where I write later in the slide deck that can be a kind of a canary in the coal mine for strategics. If you're not following the state and federal sunshine reporting requirements, that can be a sign that the company does not have a robust compliance function. Again, I'm going to spend a little bit more time on this slide than I will on the others, just because this is important stuff. How you're supporting the reimbursement function, big area, hot topic. If I'm auditing a company, or if our team is, that's a huge area that we delve into, because if you provide inappropriate coding advice, or you're providing inappropriate support through the reimbursement process, you're hitting on Anti-Kickback, False Claims Act, probably HIPAA. There may be FDA issues with your promotion. It just hits on so many different aspects. You want to be really careful with making sure you're buttoned up with how you discuss reimbursement information. How are you providing discounts and rebates? Are they in compliance with a safe harbor on point? Are you providing training? Your slides they're going to be reviewed by the strategic. What if you get an off-label question? How do you deal with that? Is the sales rep responding to that question? They shouldn't be if they are. Is that going to medical affairs? Grants. All your grant agreements are going to be reviewed meticulously by the auditor. Royalty arrangements, hot topic, pretty common in device. You want to make sure that your percentages aren't out of whack, and that you're not just giving KOLs royalty arrangements to get them to use your product. Collaborative marketing, co-marketing is now a portion of the AVIMED code that's been added recently. Research activities, distributor practices. Are your distributors being vetted? How do you vet them? What about privacy compliance? That's a big issue now with GDPR, for example, CCPA, that we expect federal legislation to come through the US at some point. And then finally, just applying AVIMED or pharma or a corollary in Europe or wherever it may be to your sales and marketing practices. And I don't know, I know I spoke a lot there. Andreas, if you have anything to add, please feel free. Otherwise, I'll just keep moving.
No, actually, it would quite be the same in Germany, obviously with a little bit different flavor, but in general, it's the same. What I find interesting, I was, as mentioned at the beginning, working for a bank for a couple of years. And so then the compliance, it's more like rigid, it's more supervised, it's also put into law and guidelines. But you have two aspects that are missing both in the US and in Germany, which are, in my opinion, outsourcing. There's a strong emphasis on outsourcing for banks, and also like IT infrastructure security, which at least in the past months here in Germany and Europe became more and more an issue also for medical providers. So I think that's probably something that we will see in the future more in health care environment as well, I would suppose. So what do you think?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. Yeah, appreciate that. Okay, let's go to the next slide here. So we'll talk now specifically, we're kind of talking strategy so far a bit. We need to get tactical now. So I think we've impressed upon you the importance of having a compliance program in place. Well, how do you get it in place? Where do you begin? I know Andreas and I and his colleagues as well have worked with lots of pharmaceutical medical device companies around the world. If Cord were on the phone, I'd be kind of curious to hear what his response would be to this question, like how many of his clients have a compliance officer when he first meets them. Because it's not uncommon at all for me and the team here in the US to work with a startup, for example. One of the first questions is, who's the compliance officer? Well, and they don't have one. So for sure, by the time you get to a strategic or an auditor, you're looking at a transaction, you have to have an answer to that question. So, at a base, that could be the CEO of a small company or the CFO or the VP of regulatory. If you're entering that mid-tier stage and you've got a general counsel now, then that compliance officer the GC could also have the compliance officer title. Eventually that person will probably be so busy in their job that they'll have to hire someone to have a compliance officer in-house. But it's very common for that compliance officer to report through the GC, sometimes the CFO. The government sometimes argues that's a conflict if they're reporting through a GC. I don't think it is. In fact, my preference would be to have that compliance officer reporting through the GC, but save that for another time. So first, get a compliance officer in place, and that person really needs to then be in charge of compliance. They should create a plan. Of course, that person will probably need help. You could hire someone or get a contractor. We'll talk more about that in a minute. But outline a plan. If you are a small company, you're not going to need a compliance program like Pfizer or Medtronic or some multi-billion huge company that has been in trouble with the government plenty of times. Let's say you don't need to have the as sophisticated as a compliance program as someone like that. Compared to a startup, for example, you're going to just need to right size your program. Once you have a plan in place, again, I'm skipping ahead a bit because I want to tell you more about what should be in your plan, but you ultimately want to clue in your audit committee. There's new obligations that exist as of recently where the OIG is saying, hey, your board really, the board really needs to be responsible for compliance and be aware of compliance and educated on it. So some of these topics we're talking about today, the board needs to be tuned in. So ultimately, you'll want to tune in your audit committee or debrief them. Hey, this is what we're doing in the compliance world for our company. Start by deploying must-have policies and procedures. We'll talk about that in a minute. And just, I'm getting a bit tactical here, but don't try and deploy a dozen procedures at once. Try one or two at a time. And you want to socialize those with your team, get their feedback, and then ultimately put them into place. So I say here, don't let them collect dust, because if you go to a law firm or whomever and say, can I get a policy on interactions, how my staff should interact with healthcare professionals, and then you get it, it sits on your desk, and you never deploy it, you never train to it, it's really worthless at that point. I remember back in law school at Mitchell Hamlin, we actually have a program that focuses on healthcare compliance. And at the time, this was at Hamlin, we had a assistant U.S. attorney who was teaching the class, and he had made this very comment himself, and he prosecuted healthcare fraud, abuse, and medical device and drug companies and whatnot. And he said, I'd walk into the office sometimes and they'd have a big binder, 3-ring binder, they pull it down from the shelf and say, look, I have a compliance program. And he said he didn't care because it wasn't in place. Literally these binders would have dust on them, so they were not effectuated. And I think, Andreas, you might have a comment on that as well, based on some of your experience. You've seen that occur where there's policies and procedures, but they're not implemented. Is that correct? Oh, I think I might have surprised Andreas there. I'm going to just keep going.
Andreas, I think you're on mute.
I'm on mute, yeah, that's the reason. Okay, no, you're absolutely right. It's very important that you set up this program, work with it, and then implement it step by step. And as you actually point out later on as well, it's really about doing it and not feeling forced to do it or thinking this is something you do for the benefit of somebody else. It should be really in the interest of the company. And it is in the best interest of the company, because if it isn't, then actually it's the wrong process that you're implementing.
Yeah. This bullet was actually added, this next one, make your compliance program part of your organization's culture. Amanda Johnston at our firm added that one. She reviewed my slides for the presentation. She's former head of compliance for Coloplast in North America, which is a Danish medical technology company that also sells drugs. But I thought that was an astute addition, making compliance part of the culture. And I really mean this, please take this to heart. Don't view compliance review as sales prevention. We do run into situations like that where we're brought in to help remediate or audit or whatever it may be. And there's this tension between the commercial function and perhaps the legal function, compliance function. And they just like are, hey, these guys are just here to slow us down and put stop signs up. We don't need compliance ruining sales for us. But I worked in a commercial capacity for a decade, so I appreciate that they don't want to be slowed down, but it's for the best. It's for their own good. For actual individuals, it's for the company's own good. It's for the own good of for patients. We don't want patients to be taking drugs or being implanted with devices or whatever it may be because there's a bribe behind that. I think everyone can appreciate that makes sense, or that the message is not completely truthful, or if it's misleading. So, and I think 99.9% of people have good intentions, and it's just kind of getting the commercial team to appreciate that the compliance review, it's necessary. It keeps everyone out of trouble. And this next bullet, take this one to heart too. A skilled compliance professional should be able to help a company or their client accomplish their goal in a lawful fashion. So, there's ways that you can tweak things. Well, we can't do this. We can't pay this rate, but we can pay this rate. Or, we can't take these patient records in because they have PHI in them, but we can de-identify them, and then we can do that. Or we can't just pay for this billboard along the freeway for this physician, but perhaps we can have a collaborative arrangement where they pay half, you pay half, or it's Facebook, social media, marketing, whatever it may be. There's ways to do things. That said, sometimes the answer is no, and that's life. It needs to be that way. My last bullet here, be careful who you hire into a compliance function. If you are thinking, well, we're getting to the stage where we can't outsource this, and we don't have the skills in-house, so we need a compliance professional. Don't hire someone that is anti-business. That's not written down in government guidance anywhere. That's Mark Gardner's advice. I've seen folks in compliance roles that are just trying to get a pound of flesh out of the commercial team, or they see everything as a huge issue, and you need someone that can work and negotiate with a business and obviously be firm on and hold to the law, but they need to be part of that team. So you need someone that has the acumen and the emotional IQ to work with strong personalities in sales and marketing roles. Okay, a bit more on establishing the compliance program. What does that mean? Again, I talked this a little bit earlier. You need someone that's been there, done that. Don't have a rookie come in and think that they're going to pick up compliance. I have seen staff hired in a compliance officer role that went and got training, for example, at law schools or wherever it may be, and have been certified to do so. That works. But what you don't want is someone to just pick this up that doesn't know what they're doing, because that could actually do more harm than good. Another thing you want to do right away is get a hotline in place. That is pardon the pun there, a hot topic, if you will, with the government. They will ask you, where's your hotline? Have you gotten any reports to your hotline? Does your hotline work? Who answers the phone? The hotline is a place for someone to call if they see something wrong, where they can call in anonymously and say, hey, my boss is telling me to bribe this doctor. I don't want to do that. You need that kind of safety valve. Conduct training, really important. And I know training takes a lot of time. You want your salespeople selling, they've got to be trained. The government expects them to be trained every year and at point of hire. Have a compliance committee. So that's usually going to be like your general counsel. Your compliance officer is going to run the meeting. You're going to have your CFO on it, probably your VP of regulatory. Those are the core functions that would be on it. You could add some more if you like. There's no finish line for compliance. You're going to want to be auditing your program about once a year, and then spot checking it throughout the year. So when issues come up like this new OIG guidance, special fraud alert, you're going to want to compare your speaker program to what the government expects. So that would be something that we'd call that monitoring. You would do that in real time. I'd also establish a work plan or an audit plan, and I have some thoughts for you that'll come up in a little bit about an audit plan. Be prepared to have your program pressure tested or test yourself with a third party. And Andreas, I'll ask you in a moment here to talk a little bit about this because I know you've had some experience with this. But first, I'll just, before I have you chime in, what I'm saying here, or what we're saying is be prepared to demonstrate that your program works. So you could do this could be manifested through past reports, for example, if you're comfortable sharing those with an auditor. Your compliance committee minutes, your training materials, things like that. You want to be able to actually show, look, we have a compliance program. Here's the proof of it. And, maybe we've gotten a hotline report and we investigated that. So you want to show, not just tell, you want to show them how your program is in place and some of the product that has come from it, if you will. Andreas, any comments on that?
Yes, I was involved actually, or I had the pleasure actually to partake in a audit by banking authorities of German bank, and obviously that's like the hardest test that such a compliance program can have. And I guess it's a little bit repetitive, but it's again really they want to see that you live what you wrote down. And so if you really can do that for yourself internally in advance, and to verify that you don't look at paper and yes, you have put down all the procedures and rules and that's it, but you can really assure that this is what is going to be lived and worked at on a daily basis. I think then first you have a good the good comfort that there are no hidden risks for you involved, and then obviously you're very well prepared if such an audit comes up. Yes,
absolutely. Yeah. So you can, there's plenty of law firms out there that, or contractors for that matter, that are not lawyers, that can help you review your compliance. Good idea to have a third party do that. I write here also that, how are you going to wow them? If you want to wow them, you can't say, well, we're going to put this compliance program in place, because again, this will be you'll spend potentially days on compliance. The auditors for sure will be pouring through all of your materials, and sometimes they'll even charge you for that. As part of your deal, we're going to do X diligence on you, and you're going to pay for it as part of the deal structure. Just had a client go through that recently. And in fact, the CFO after was saying to the CEO, I wish you hadn't agreed to have those costs covered by us, because then you're paying lawyers on their side to just bill as many hours as possible to do lots of work reviewing. So we're going to want to talk about what you've done, not what you're going to do. So have your program in place. This is kind of tongue in cheek, but the road to hell is paved with good intentions. So get to it. Don't say you're going to do it. Do it. Make the investment. It will pay off. And as Andreas said, it will give you peace of mind. As I say here, it'll help you sleep at night. So what are the things you have to have? Again, now we're pretty tactical. Use this as a checklist. If you're looking to attract capital next year, go public, get bought out, you need to have these things in place by the time you start your conversations, I'd say, because you're going to be grilled on all these things. I have had a lot of clients that, they'll say, hey, we're going to do a deal next year, and they'll get these things in place maybe 6 months before the deal. And they've asked me, are they going to look at the rev dates and say, gee, you just did all this stuff, now we're uncomfortable? I wouldn't really worry about that. I would just get it in place. You guys can read the slide here. I'll go through it quickly, but it's having a policy on how you interact with your customers, the HCPs, code of conduct, your compliance and investigations policy. That's a high level overarching policy that says, here are the rules, we follow them. Here's our committee. Here's our compliance officer. Having a charter, having an advertising review process for your promotional materials. How do you engage physicians? That's a fee for service arrangement, SOP. Needs assessment. How are you hiring doctors? You need to have a plan for that. It shouldn't just be the product manager saying, well, I need 10 because I need 10. There needs to be some forethought going into it. If you're doing business overseas, you need a Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, FCPA policy, grants policy, how you respond to off-label questions, how you report to authorities on who you're paying. That's the transparency reporting, i.e. sunshine reporting, and then a privacy policy. If you have these core things and you're 90% there, you could add all these other things if you like, to the extent necessary. We have a booth conduct here, a few bullets down. Not a lot of booths out there these days. Hopefully with the vaccine coming online here, I read this morning that the UK authorities just approved Pfizer's emergency use authorization for their, which was actually oriented out of Germany, I believe. Andreas, give Germany credit there, by some Turkish inventors, scientists. But so some of these you're not going to need. In other words, you're not going to need a booth conduct policy probably right now because there's not a lot of trade shows. But take a look at this list. I have speaker bureau. Maybe that goes to the must-have list now, given that the government is so keen on speaker bureaus. So I'm going to skip ahead so I don't read all these. Andreas, did you have a comment? I sense maybe you wanted to say something.
No. That's
I'm going to keep going. This is a punch list where, I just added this in actually this morning because I thought it was nagging at me. I want to get as tactical as possible for the audience here so you can actually put some of these things into action. This is just one that I redacted. This is something we use as a tool with GCs, for example, setting up compliance programs. So I won't read through all this. You'll have the slides, but I have number 1 on here. Get your hotline in place. Some of these were in yellow because these were our priorities. This GC wanted to present to the board to show them that what they were doing, notifying staff of the hotline. There's a whole bunch of good stuff in here for you guys to use. These were the policies and procedures that we wanted to have in place. A lot of these are the ones I just went over. Here I have HCC training. This is speaker training. They had a big speaker bureau, so we needed to make sure we trained the speakers. Just to pause there for a moment, your speakers are an extension of the company, and they're your agents. The government argue. You could argue back, well, they're not our agents, but the government probably would apply the doctrine of respondeat superior there and say you're paying them, you're responsible for them. So you need to train them to follow the rules. They can't go out and promote off-label and then you hide behind and say, oh, the doctor said that. The company didn't. The government will just come back and say, well, you're speaking through your paid agent. A couple other things you can see, we got a bunch of things done. Here was, we actually audited them. That's a good way to go about it in the beginning when you're starting your compliance program. Before you even start, do an audit, because then you can see where the gaps are. Okay, we're kind of shifting gears here now into what are the questions you're going to get. So Andreas, did you want to cover, I think you were going to cover this slide here.
Actually, I just wanted to comment on that. Like the punchline of that slide, I think is what we said before. You really have to live the program. So it really has to be implemented. You have to live it. And so what then the result is, obviously, if you're going to get a question and you don't know the answer, or actually there might be a gap, it's something to be implemented and so on, that's fine to say it out and frank, and everybody will understand, because there's so much to be covered. And what we just saw, that there's so many new developments in the compliance area that you can't be expected to cover all. So if you can say we have it implemented and this is what we have covered, and then suddenly, okay, and this is to be implemented, I think that just shows that you really have these things in place, and it's not just a plan that you're talking about or something you put off the shelf. So this is, I think, what you highlighted here with T-last. You should be frank, and you should be proud of what you're doing. So simply really explain what you're doing in precise wording, instead of like just having an off-the-shelf standard template, and everybody will see, okay, nice, but that's just the compliance idea, and it's not what the company and the organization actually adheres to.
Mm-hmm. Yep, exactly. And this little acronym, you all can use this. This comes from a team member that was previously at the FDA, actually. And he and I have taught some law school classes together, and this is something where we train the students on, and it's actually used with the industry. We train industry on it as well. We really intend this for when you're talking to an FDA regulator, or you're talking to the Department of Justice, whomever it may be, some authority. The last thing you want to do is perjure yourself if you don't tell the truth. So it doesn't quite, there's differences, nuances here from a transaction standpoint, but obviously you don't want to mislead or provide false information to the party that's looking to buy you, and your representations and warranties and your purchase or sale agreement obviously if you're issuing more stock or whatever it may be, you're going to be held accountable to everything that you attest to or make representations about. So tell the truth, listen to the question from your auditor, respond to that question. You don't need to go on and on. This is the type of coaching that I give with the GC or the CFO or CEO or whomever it is before we go on the phone with an auditor. Stop after you answer the question. We don't want these calls to go on and on. You probably have several attorneys on the line. It's expensive, it's time consuming, and we don't want to create new issues that we don't, want to. We don't want to create new issues. Let's just leave it there. Tell the truth. Again, that's so important that we list that one twice. If you do get a question that you don't know the answer to, take a note, get back to them. I state here, open the kimono where necessary, but you don't need to go on and on. And be careful, if you did do an audit and you have a report, perhaps you don't want to share that. If you do, you're going to lose privilege with that report. Here are a lot of questions, just out of the interest of time, just looking at my watch, we have about 45 minutes left, so we do have plenty of time. But I may not read all of these in detail with you, but what are some things that you should be asking about if you're a buyer, and prepared to talk about if you're a seller? What is your corporate culture like when it comes to compliance? Is there a clear, visible commitment to compliance by senior leaders? Well, how would you measure that? Again, it would go back to the compliance committee, and it would go back to the CEO being tuned in. If there's an issue, maybe you've had whistleblowers, is the CEO tuned into resolving that? If you've got a lot of whistleblowers, probably something going on with your compliance program there that could be improved. So how is that being addressed, for example? This is a tough one. Amanda also added this one, and I think it was smart of her too. Is compliance/ethics a component of performance reviews? I think where you could get into that, not being an HR professional, I'd look at that like, if someone has been breaking the rules, does that affect their bonus? Maybe their expense reports they didn't just go over $5 on a physician meal once. They've had to have 3 talks this year with compliance, and the next talk is you're fired maybe. But would that affect their review or their bonus, for example? Obviously it should. How is staff raising concerns? Where do they go? Do they know how to raise them? Is there a dedicated compliance function? These are the types of things that the auditor will look at. Do you have an officer? Do you have a committee? Pretty fundamental. We talked about that. But that's very important. I'll let you guys read these other bullets on your own. How often do you meet? Do you have agendas? Do you have minutes? You're going to be asked these things. When was it in panel? Some more questions. Enforcing standards through well-publicized guidelines. How are you doing that? I've had some clients where these are more sophisticated companies, but they'll actually have posters on the wall or on an easel that says, here's the hotline. If you have an issue, call this hotline. So that's one way of publicizing those guidelines. And this says disciplinary guidelines. I mean, this would be in your code of conduct. It would say if you don't follow the rules, you may be fired, or you may get a warning, for example. How do you report violations? Do you have, again, the hotline? How does the report get submitted? Where does it go? I talked a little bit about that earlier. How promptly do you investigate allegations of noncompliance? That's something that came out of the settlement with Covidian, which was earlier this year. It feels like a million years ago now, given everything dealt with recently. That was back in March, and they talked a little bit about in the complaint. They didn't think that the company followed up quickly enough on some of this whistleblower's concerns. Whether that's true or not is another matter. But the government does consider how fast you follow up, and therefore your auditors are going to ask, how fast are you following up? Promptly responding to problems, we just talked about this. But let's say you have an issue that you need to disclose. They're going to dig into that. And they're going to ask, how was that detected? They'll get into your investigations procedure likely and see if you followed it and if corrective action was taken. Which, by the way, never call for action that's not taken. That's problematic. What about your policies and procedures? This is an area where the auditor can, look on paper at what the policy is. Sometimes they'll go in further and audit you against your policy or procedure. Frankly, I don't see that as much because time is usually of the essence in these transactions, and they don't always have time. The seller may not be willing to allow them to really get into that sort of detail where they start interviewing staff to see, or attending speaker programs. Might not be a bad idea, frankly, if you're a buyer, to say, I'd like to go to one of your speaker programs and see the content and how it's presented. I think it actually would be there's probably not enough done in this environment where policies and procedures could be audited against, but they'll definitely get reviewed. I note here, do your policies and procedures, are they released in your quality management system, for example, or some system parallel? Perhaps you don't want to put your PMPs, your policies and procedures, in your QMS. Maybe you want to have your own separate doc control system so that FDA can't review your compliance PMPs. That'd be perfectly fine. For what it's worth, I do see most companies just have these policies put into their QMS, but not all. It depends on the company. How do you review them? For example, if you have a speaker bureau SOP, are you reviewing that now in light of the recent special fraud alert from the OIG? So be prepared to put all those policies and procedures in the data room, though. Training, they're going to ask for your training material, how often people are trained, etc. You should be keeping a record of everyone that you train. These are some other topics I think I'd add to this list, Andres, given your feedback around IT. Probably adding some of that as another area that you would be asked about. But kind of within the regulatory realm, healthcare compliance, I'd say regulatory / healthcare compliance. You're definitely going to be asked about your FDA background. Have you had 43s, warning letters, untitled letters, consent decrees, any other investigations? They're going to ask about what's your product pipeline look like, where, I've seen some get granular on even asking about 510K submissions perhaps that are put forth, or other, NDA or whatever it may be, asking questions about that. This is a bit more contemporary. Privacy compliance is really big. 10 years ago, it was less of a concern. Now it's front and center. So be prepared to have your GDPR, readiness assessed big time. Quality as well. Seen more of that recently, where the strategic, for example, will really dig into any, complaints, CAPAs, other issues that may be associated with the quality of the product. And then transparency. Are you following transparency rules? What kind of patient interaction do you have? Vetting distributors, your licenses, registrations. A lot of states have rules around you're bringing drugs into our state and distributing them, or medical devices. That is often a surprise, especially to device companies, that they need to be registered and licensed within states. And then I put here COVID-19 matters because we're just involved in some diligence for a client, and they were raising some capital, and they got a lot of COVID-19 questions, which was interesting. I don't know, Andreas, if you have anything you'd like to add.
No, I think I would then continue with the next page, if you're fine. This is more like the view of the transactional lawyer on the due diligence. So besides the compliance due diligence, you would start actually to get a good understanding of the products you're talking about here, the drugs, medical devices, and so on, and look what the status of the development is. Next step then for the lawyers is to look into the IP situation, like who has developed, is it an own development, has it been licensed in that product, and if so, the chain of assignments should then be reviewed. You have permits and certifications. That's definitely an overlap with the compliance. Here, we would only mostly look at simply the existence and status. But obviously that should interact with the compliance due diligence as well, to be sure that we take appropriate steps here to retain and keep the permits, and that we know what to do to keep them in the future. Production, how are the products being produced? And this is mostly from a legal perspective. The contract manufacturing obviously overlaps with the certifications as well, and compliance again if you produce yourself. And then on the next slide, distribution, that's the same in, I would assume, as in the US. You would look at the permits, as you just said, also for on the state level. You would look at the distribution agreements. What is the status of that product with the national health system? Can you get reimbursed as a patient? Very important in Germany, but actually most of the countries. Compliance, we just discussed. It's comparable to what you have already discussed, and now more and more implemented into statutory law in Germany as well, and not only in the code of conduct. We, from a transactional perspective, would also look at finance and subsidies, because this is like a particularity here. You have quite often subsidies and subsidized financings by banks that are part of national programs or EU programs, and you have to be sure that you don't have any covenants or restrictions you should be aware of, so that you know that you can implement your plans for that company for the future. Cooperation agreements, obviously, very interesting here compared to other industries, because that's the pipeline, that's the future of the company. And also you have to be sure that you know what is going to happen with the joint developments, for example, who is going to own the IP, how can you use it. Litigation and authorities here, like the back end, so to say, of the compliance efforts. Obviously, you have to be sure that you know what has happened, and you want to be sure that you are aware of any communication with the authorities. In particular, if there would have been an audit to some extent.
Great.
So talking about deal structures, like the typical question you have in the US as well, do you do a share deal? Do you do an asset deal? Here, the main driver for that discussion are usually permits and certifications, because you have permits and certifications that are attached to the product and or the production. and you have personal certifications and permits that you cannot simply transfer. So in the later case, obviously, you would then prefer a share deal. Quite often, obviously, as always, you have tax considerations here as well. That's in particular when you think about mergers, which in Germany and in Europe actually under European law can be done on a tax neutral way. And so that might be one way how to structure the acquisition. What I've found in the past, and I'm not sure whether it's probably, I would assume it's the same in the US, but obviously I only have the experience here in Germany. You see, when you see the targets, you are surprised when you compare that to other industries, how many shareholders you have in the smaller companies. It's quite often a lot of small investors, of doctors, of scientists, and then smaller venture capital funds. And so it's quite often a very complex shareholding structure. And that means you usually would not be so interested into a shareholder agreement, for example, because that's going to lapse anyway when you acquire the company. Here, it's of interest because that is the key document that would give you deal security, because if they don't have a strong shareholders agreement, obviously you can't be sure that you would get an agreement with any and all of the shareholders. Strategic investors I've mentioned here because obviously you have to, if you have a competitor being invested in your target already, that might create some frictions. Transitional SLAs are also a particularity here because in other industries you can integrate the operation quite quickly. Here you have the permits, you have the products that are being labeled, and the production which is certified and which can't be changed so quickly. So quite often you will see that you can't integrate the company as soon as you would wish and prefer, and therefore you would enter into transitional service levels agreements to continue the business for the interim. Purchase price considerations here. It's very important to understand what are you purchasing for which reason. Is it the product that you're purchasing? Is it the distribution channel? Is it really the inventions being made by that company? So is it more like the key personnel? Is it the IP? And this should then be reflected in the pricing mechanism to be sure that you are safeguarded here. And the typical problem here to the labeling of the product is pipeline stuffing, meaning it could happen that you purchase the company and then you realize, okay, for a certain period after the acquisition, you're not able to sell as the company could before. Representations and warranties would reflect all of that, and the incentive program for the key personnel is important, in particular for the small companies that you purchase, because the inventions are being made obviously just by a few people in that organization, and so you have to be sure that you will keep them. And the discussions, I think, are quite the same in the US and in America about how you can restrict them to compete. And because that has its limits, the incentive is usually the right way how to tackle that problem. I spoke here with a couple of people. Actually, I would say, as usually in that M&A area, it depends on who you're talking to. I think what looks for me quite obvious is that in the market, the prices have not been affected by COVID-19, meaning the multiples have remained the same, obviously gone up in certain areas which are COVID-19 related, but So the prices did not go down. The activity, you hear different things. Some people see that there was a small slowdown. I'm not 100% sure that is true. I mean, it's always a problem of the figures that you get. I think obviously it's going to be, it's my personal opinion, I think it's going to be a very interesting market in the future, more and more, simply because of the changes in other industries. So obviously COVID-19 does not mean that there is more interest now in medtech or in pharma all over the place. But you have a lot of money going around. COVID-19 results in even more money coming into the market that has to be invested. Private equity is actually very well funded and has a lot of money to be invested. And for them, as I said, certain other industries like automotive are not interesting anymore. So I would assume we will see more and more here with certain effects. That means, for example, the processes, that's something that we have seen in particular in the automotive sector a couple of years ago. As a strategic investor, you have to get very quick here. You have to have a very focused M&A track to be sure that you can compete with private equity investors that are able to make a binding offer in a couple of weeks. Also, like, your due diligence process has to be well structured. So you have to have your team in place and have to be able to coordinate it so that you can compete in such a competitive manner if necessary. And that's probably why I would say, yes, we will see more M&A activity in the future. Case studies, I think I have actually touched them already to some extent. The problem of the many shareholders, how to keep key personnel. One in the first case, which was like a very small medical device developer, I found it very interesting that the whole deal structure changed a couple of times. It was at the beginning like a minority investment, then it became a majority investment, then it was like some cooperation included as well, with a joint development and with options. And that's something you usually do not see, at least like in the private equity sector, obviously. So I think that's something why the M&A in this field is a specialty, because it's not simply about buying, it's really about understanding the incentive of the purchaser to acquire that business and finding ways how to implement it. And these ways might be not off-the-shelf standard solutions. The second was a bigger transaction, actually Intersect acquiring Viagon. I found it interesting that is public, was closed within the COVID-19 pandemic. And so yes, video conferencing negotiations are possible. I think that's a key takeaway, which I would hope would also result in even more business between Europe and America, because it's getting easier, and even with the different time zones, if you don't have to stay in the office until midnight, but you can do that via video conferencing, it's not a big obstacle anymore. And then the typical things are key personnel and key tech structures, obviously the typical questions you have in such a transaction.
Great, that's very helpful. Thank you, Andreas. Briefly, just a couple slides here on some do's and don'ts during a transaction. And feel free to jump in here, Andreas, if you like. But these are some things to think about during the pending transaction. So things you can do: exchange publicly available information, hold joint meetings, but limit the meetings to necessary to be included, and limit information disclosure. So obviously what you want to be careful here is that you're not violating antitrust rules. That's really the background for all these do's and don'ts. Joint presentations may be held. Business strategies for the time after the clearance of the concentration may be presented. Make plans regarding personnel and nominations of personnel, provided that the positions are not actually assumed. Do develop joint reporting organizational structures. Do develop a future strategy for the time after clearance, meaning after the government's approved the transaction of the concentration respectively after expiration of waiting periods. Do nominate future teams. Do prepare joint market appearance for time after clearance. Do have information events for affected employees, etc. What else do we have here? Do perform training of employees regarding future conduct for the time after clearance of the concentration. So again, that maybe you do some prospective compliance training for after the close. Do publish newsletters containing information regarding the future internal personal structure and after appointment of personnel. Some do nots. Do not enter into an agreement on the segmentation of customers or markets. So again, that could be seen as anti-competitive. Do not make agreements on prices. Price fixing could be a big issue. Do not provide rebates on production or supply quantities or any other joint strategies. I'll let you read the part in parens there for yourself. Do not create the impression the companies will be integrated prior to the clearance. Okay. Do not combine the legal and organizational structure of the entities. Do not enter joint business activities. Do not implement joint reporting and organizational structures. Do not adjust and adapt products. Now I'm sounding like the no fun place here, but these are all in your best interest here. Do not coordinate mutual marketing distributor efforts. Do not execute corporate rights of controls. Do not rename and or create a joint marketing campaign or engage in joint distribution. I am not an antitrust lawyer, but we do obviously deal in a lot of transactions, and these are do's and don'ts that I think are somewhat universal. So take them for what they're worth. But some things to think about. I think the takeaway is you don't want to act like you're a partner with the company and doing these things that we talked about that you can't do until the deal is closed. All right, we have a couple case studies here, and then we'll wrap up. It's been awfully quiet. I don't think Freya has any questions for us yet, but hopefully we'll get some here at the end. Case study one, I've just named each one of these for fun. Seen around corners. So drug device combination product maker plans to go public. They're rapidly growing company. Sophisticated CEO comes in to take over. They really didn't have a compliance function at this point. They're leading up to an IPO. The GC recognized they need a compliance function and commenced building out a compliance program. Hired outside counsel to perform a compliance audit. These are the steps they took. So maybe one of these 5 case studies will sound like you and hopefully be helpful. They do an external audit with third party. What came of that? Well, all of the policies and procedures that needed to be right sized for this company. Compliance officer getting nominated along with the compliance committee. They updated their board on their activities. Staff were trained. Quality matrix was established for training requirements. Each function would have a different set of training needs on the compliance front. They also partnered with their commercial team and said, hey, we're all in this together. We need to get compliant. Some changes were made. Outcome later, when they're going public, the underwriter came in and a lot of trouble was avoided because, for one thing, they had the appearance of a compliance program being in place with a compliance officer, compliance committee, but they also lived to it. And they did this entity did end up sharing their privilege report because they felt like it was the right move and they weren't concerned about doing so. But the underwriter was quite pleased. It helps when you know as much or more than the underwriter, the attorneys that the underwriter has hired. And that's a key takeaway here is just why do I recommend that you do this compliance auditing and monitoring? It's not only because you're going to get a deal done, but you're going to avoid potential civil criminal liability for individuals, for the company. You're doing things the right way. Patients are better off. There's so many good reasons to do this. But obviously you're going to have, like this company, hopefully pass with flying colors. Another case study, not such a good one. This was a deal that I was brought in on kind of, too late, frankly, the under provision ship. And sometimes, every situation's different. This was a device maker that just wasn't really hitting their stride. Their technology wasn't as sexy as perhaps some of the others in the space, but they did have a strategic come and say, hey, we're interested in you. It looked like the deal was done until the strategic started to dig into their compliance. Long story short, they had some HIPAA issues that the strategic became concerned about and said, we're pulling out. Whether that was true or not, maybe it was ostensibly for HIPAA reasons, but bottom line, their response was they weren't comfortable moving ahead. I say under provision ship because, just to flip back, because they really did not invest in compliance. They had a few policies and procedures, they did a little training, but they went halfway, and every situation's different. I don't begrudge them. They just probably didn't have the resources to do all that they could. Next case study, the close call. This involved a drug maker that was, and again, I've redacted all this to keep, to obviously not share any privileged information, but this involved a drug maker that was looking at a distribution arrangement with maybe more to come later. Obviously a lot of deals start with a distribution agreement and then turn into more, where a smaller company may get bought by that strategic. In this case, the senior management team met with the leadership from their strategic, and they got the heebie-jeebies right away from some comments made about the strategic, and there was concerns around bribery. Again, I'm not going to get into the details, but there are literally people in jail because years later, some of these kind of red flags turned into government prosecution for the strategic, and they're now bankrupt. So I call this the close call because this isn't all just about, hey, we're selling our company, so we want to provide the appearance of a compliance program that makes sense. You also want to look at this like, who are you getting into bed with? Like, if the strategic is a bad actor, that could be career ending for you, or turn out very badly for your current investors, depending on the deal. So think of some of the unintended consequences that can come, and you should be reviewing who you're going to do a deal with as well, just like that company very wisely did. By the way, they later had an exit that was very good for them, and they avoided what was at the time, a very good, or strategic with what appeared to be a good track record that turned out that they did not, because the public didn't know about these issues that were occurring. Case study 4, all in. This is an example of CEO that I've worked with at a couple different companies, and he had a class 3, really fantastic technology, great data. This was one of those companies that we've all seen that we just knew that good things were coming. It's just a matter of time before a strategic came along and snapped them up. And they went through a couple rounds of diligence. The first was they weren't really ready to sell the company, and they had a strategic get very interested, and they dug in and they came up with a quality concern. We weren't really sure if this was true or not. Thought they were probably just trying to get a discount. Companies backed off of that, and that experience made them think, you know what, they weren't heavily commercialized at that point yet, and they said, we didn't really enjoy that experience with that diligence experience, so we're going to really invest heavily in the healthcare compliance, which is a hot topic, and in this space that they were in was there was a competitor being prosecuted. So they ended up deploying a best-in-class program. They had at their national sales meeting, they'd have for example, a compliance portion of that. They've got all their policies and procedures in place, did new hire training, really stayed on top of things. Kind of cut to the chase here. They ended up, selling, and the strategic, a very large company, was really quite pleased with the compliance program. And we're talking, a lot of strategics, especially the big ones, they've been in 1, 2, 3, maybe more corporate integrity agreements, CIAs. They don't have time to fool around with companies that they feel like are going to be a compliance risk to them, because it'll affect the brand for that company. Every time they're in the news, something bad, that's not good for their brand. And it's all obviously also not good for patients. So this was a nice example. I also noted here that the compliance officer, which was actually yours truly in this case, I became a real part of that business, and I was actually on site with that company frequently. And the business partners there got it, and they were appreciative because they felt like they were being protected. This last one, instant compliance program, I can think of a dozen companies that have had this same set of facts come up. It could be a drug company for that matter too, but a hot company growing fast, getting a lot of attention from investors, from strategics, and they don't have a compliance function in place. So what do? They go to work, they get one in place. You guys can read the slide here. They do the training, they get all the policies and procedures we talked about in place. With as a potential hot button for the other side to walk away, and it just, things go quicker when you have that conversation about compliance and confidence. You're going to have conversations on IP and, like Andrea said, IT and all sorts of other things. So this is just one step, obviously, along the way. In closing, I'll give a couple of remarks here, Andreas, and then if you have anything to add, please do. I already mentioned this, we've seen the example on the previous slide many times. Invest the time and effort to get things in place. If you don't, you'll probably pay for it later in the form of a write-down, as Andreas talked about a little bit earlier. Literally the other side may say, well, we want a $10 million discount, or we're going to hold funds in escrow because we're worried about, such and such. Don't go halfway. I don't know if anyone knows who Ron Swanson is from Parks and Rec, a pretty funny show that my kids love. He says never half-ass two things, whole ass one thing. So go for it. Don't, invest in it. Don't have a program that's just kind of put together with super glue and duct tape. You need to actually, if you're going to do it, you do it right. It's almost worse if you go halfway. This for the device audience, not to throw shade at you, but this conversation in the drug world is usually unseen needed. There's more investment in compliance, probably because the drug companies were prosecuted so much before device. Now device is getting prosecuted as much, if not more. But this should not be an afterthought. The CEO, GC, whoever should really lead this effort and make sure that compliance is addressed. Don't lose the deal for lack of foresight on the compliance front. Be ready to, another point here before we're concluding here, be ready to answer the questions we discussed or ask them. Treat your compliance function as a asset. And then lastly, make sure you hire the right person. I don't mean to be overly harsh on people, but I've seen some compliance professionals, and usually they're lawyers, and I'm just wondering how in the world they got their job and why they are in that role, because a lot of them are just very inflexible. You're seeing it less now, but they don't seem to want to even work within the four walls of a business enterprise. So I'm not sure what led them there. But be careful with who you hire. It's very hard to remove them. If you've got the person in that wrong seat and they're heading your compliance function, they're going to be the perfect whistleblower for you. So be careful there. Andreas, did you have any other closing comments?
Yeah, no, actually just would like to repeat something you already said. It's the compliance function is and should be an asset. And so it's not only an asset when you sell it, but you should implement it. Obviously, now looking from a transaction perspective, you do that because of that due diligence. But no, if you do it right, you create an asset also for the ongoing business if you don't sell. And if you keep that in mind, actually, it's a good investment, and it should always be worth the money that you're investing here.
Great, Freya, I'll hand it back over to you.
Thank you. Actually, one question came up. So one attendee would like to know, based on your experience, how long does it take to put an effective compliance program in place?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it can be done within 6 months. We've put them into place faster, say 3 months. But the part that the kind of long pole in the tent, if you will, is like getting the policies and procedures in place. I think a conversation up front with your management team, if you're like, look, we got to get one in place in 2 months or a month, we don't have 3 months or 6 months or 12. I think it could be done. You just would really need to focus on it, and you need to talk with your management team and say, look, we need you, when we send you a policy, we need you to review it. And we're not really perhaps looking for you to provide us commentary on formatting or, just things that they don't need to, that will just slow down the process. But if you've got good policies and procedures that are in line with best practices, there shouldn't be a ton of review needed by your management team or whomever or their delegate who is assigned to that review process. But that's the long pole in the tent, is getting the policies and procedures in place. Things like getting a hotline in place, having that compliance committee and panel, having your meeting with them, even training. Those things can all go pretty quickly. Another long pole may be getting in front of your audit committee, but to explain what you're doing, but that shouldn't really delay you too much. So I think, Freya, it's a good question. I think that if it were me, I would try and budget 6 months for that, ideally.
Okay, thank you. Andreas, I saw you nodding, so it seems like you agree.
Yeah, I would maybe add it's a question of resources, and priority. Obviously, if you have, for example, a sales process coming up or the auditor coming, you can implement it fast when you have the right priority. But what you have to be aware of, you need the organization. So sometimes people think, okay, you can implement a compliance program simply, you hire an advisor and he does it from the outside. No, it really has to fit into the organization. So you need access to the people there. And obviously they have other things to do. So it's a question of priority. So if you don't give it any priority, and then you can put as many outside counsel on it as you want, then that could drag on for years. And if you have the priorities right, it can be pretty fast.
Great, thank you. Oh, Mark, did you want to add anything to that?
No, I think that's right, Andres. I'd say one other comment for those of you that are having to go through that process: just be careful not to overwhelm your team. For example, if you are going to be that compliance officer, you're probably not going to make your teammates very happy if you say, here's 12 policies and procedures, and I need you to review them over your long, holiday weekend here, because we're going to discuss them on, next Tuesday. Give them 1 or 2 at a time, allow them time to digest them. But again, I would also encourage them at the same time, if you have a good policy or procedure, you could say, look, there shouldn't be a lot of edits, but let's have a meeting next week, and you repeat that process until all the policies and procedures are in place. So just kind of the practice tip there, practice point, is don't send them 12 documents, and they're going to overwhelm them, and they're probably going to want to disengage from the process. Do 1 or 2 at a time.
Thank you. That's it for the questions, but in my experience, questions often come up after the webinar, so feel free to contact Mark or Andreas. The contact details are here below, and do not hesitate to contact them if you have any more questions. Also, I would like to point out that once you leave the webinar, a quick survey will pop up, and we would really appreciate it if you could participate in the survey. Well, I would like to thank you, Mark and Andreas, for your update on regulatory compliance due diligence.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you to the attendees for joining in today.
Great. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Have a good day. Bye-bye.
Bye. Have a great week.